Tomorrow's workforce is in today's classrooms.
How we can harness the power of digital technology.
So essential to being connected.
And one of the enablers of that is technology.
Digital Empowers is all about harnessing the power of technologies.
It's such an equalizer, right? It creates access to opportunity.
It's an opportunity to bring together the business sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government sector to use technology to solve some of the biggest societal issues.
The unique group of people who are in the room, the thought leadership is just off the charts.
This partnership between TCS and the Chamber Foundation is really about bringing together community partners to solve societal problems.
What is driving innovation? What is driving social change?
It really takes lots of organizations and individuals with different core competencies.
Interdisciplinary ecosystems that involve higher education, K-12, seamlessly orchestrating
To create an environment where folks really can thrive.
But it's critical that there be convenings like this around preparing that future workforce for the kind of work that awaits them.
Technology can be part of the solution.
How do we prepare individuals to be ready for those next opportunities?
And we can all move forward together.
Hello, everyone. This is Balaji Ganapati here from Tata Consultancy Services. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to this next edition of Digital Empower series. Today, we are going to talk about bridging the digital divide. But let me take a step back and talk to you a few context setting points around why this discussion is important and why TCS and the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation are working to promote this sort of a discussion. 2 years ago, when we came together to form this partnership with the US Chamber Foundation on Digital Empowers, it was very clear that technology was revolutionizing the way we live, the way we work, the way we eat, the way we play. And it was really becoming a force of change for not just businesses and consumers, but for society at large. Today, we are in a different state of affairs in the country and in the world around us with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the challenges that existed before the pandemic hit us is further exacerbated by the onset of the pandemic. It has clearly demonstrated that it is really important for organizations from across sectors to come together to understand what is the role of technology in solving business problems, in solving societal problems, and in creating innovations that can help bridge inequities that exist in society. Digital Empowers and the purpose of Digital Empowers as a thought leadership series is to address this. It is to raise the awareness about technologies so that we understand what technology can do and demystify technology. It is also to explore the art of the possible so we can understand how technology is being used in different walks of life, how companies are using it for economic growth, how countries are using it for citizen services, how startups are using it to drive social innovation, how other sectors like the nonprofit sector as well as the education sector are using it to drive innovation and access to opportunities. And finally, the third purpose of Digital Empowers is to foster partnerships. So I hope that we will have a tremendous discussion today. We have a terrific set of panels and experts from across sectors, from policy, from industry, from data and government. And I think it is going to be a very insightful conversation today. From a TCS perspective, I have just a couple of points to share that at TCS, technology drives digital innovation and digital transformation for all of our customers. So, and especially during the pandemic, of course, the first and foremost focus for all of us has been the health and safety and well-being of our own employees, followed by the need and the urge and the importance to ensure that all of the important services that are being performed by our customers, whether it is pharmaceutical companies, whether it is banks, whether it is financial services, communication organizations, and others, are continuing to run in an uninterrupted manner. That is critical to support the technology infrastructure and access to services for nations and its people. But today's conversation is going to be a very intriguing one because we are talking about what has not been bridged. Yes, as an organization, we were able to quickly transform, and in the first couple of weeks of March, shift about 95% of our 500,000 workforce to work from a remote model, remote operating model. And many of our customers also have been able to move into that model, and we and others in the space are helping them do that. We were also able to move a lot of our community initiatives, which is focused on creating access to opportunities in the digital economy, especially for youth, women, and marginalized groups. We were able to pivot a lot of those programs also into a virtual mode. While potential is equally distributed in every individual around the world, opportunity is not equally distributed. And it is even more important in today's world that access to that opportunity is not stopped because of lack of access to digital, lack of access to the internet. Couple of points to close I wanted to share is that earlier this year, when the pandemic hit, about 53% of Americans, as per a Pew Research poll, said that the internet is going to be essential for them to continue in this sort of a remote environment. And it is not surprising that the latest Harris poll has revealed that more than 100 million Americans, that's one in every 3 Americans, has at least had a virtual gathering or a virtual connect through one of these remote modes. But yet there are millions of Americans around the country and households and children who do not have access to internet, do not have access to the bandwidth required to be able to participate in these opportunities. And I look forward to hearing from the experts who are following me today, and also the panels that are going to discuss today on how we can address this. So without further ado, let me introduce the first panel. And before that, I also just want to share that during today's discussion, if you have any thoughts or comments or questions, feel free to bring them up and put them in the Q&A in the chat window. Our panels and our experts will be responding to those as they go through their sessions. So, I also want to thank our partners within the Chamber Foundation. We also have the Chamber's Center for Education and Workforce and the Chamber's Technology Engagement Center, who have been supporting today's event. So get ready for an amazing set of discussions, a lot of insights and intriguing conversations. With that, let me introduce the first speaker for the day, Doug Brake, who is the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And they really put the digital divide and access to broadband into perspective through a data-driven approach. So over to you, Doug.
Great. Thank you so much, Balaji, and thank you to the Chamber Foundation, Alexa and Jordan, for having me on. The Digital Empowers program is a really fantastic one, and so I'm glad to be a part of it. As Balaji mentioned, I'm the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're a leading nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we focus on policies that we think help spur innovation with the overarching goal of the belief that innovation is the sort of key driver of economic growth long term. I would like to provide some sort of background and context information on the digital divide, as an introduction to the great couple of panels that are lined up after me. Digital divide obviously has been a central topic for broadband policy for years, decades really. Yeah, it'd be great if we can go ahead and switch over to the first slide. But by way of background, as many of you know, when it comes to broadband, the United States relies on competition between relatively large broadband companies that provide the actual internet infrastructure. We're fortunate in the United States that we started the broadband race with a large, already built copper telephone network and also a coaxial cable television network that can provide broadband. Not all countries have this. But this system with two different networks and now increasingly competition between wired networks and mobile networks allows for competition to guide broadband service with light touch regulation. We at ITIF like this model, right, because it incentivizes private investment, not just to build out the broadband networks with the technology of today, but also importantly to develop new technology. So on this first slide, I've got basically my basic thesis of a relatively recent report that we put out, Lessons of the Pandemic, and how we think broadband policy should change as a result of this current crisis we're living through. From our research, the fundamentals of our broadband system here in the United States work really remarkably well. There's no need for drastic changes to our system, but instead we should look towards really quite targeted programs aimed to close the remaining gaps in the digital divide, the gaps that the pandemic really threw into sharp relief. So I got to admit, I do get heartburn sometimes seeing not just the usual crowd calling for broadband as a public utility, but even sometimes now usually thoughtful people saying that the pandemic has shown broadband is more important than ever, and therefore it's a utility. So in my mind, this is kind of the wrong-headed approach. But really, I mean, we have an important empirical question, right? And from my research, this basic model of private competition in the actual facilities of broadband networks that the United States relies on, this is working quite well. That's been my research for a long time. But with COVID-19, right, with this pandemic, we have this really interesting natural experiment. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So we saw with the pandemic and the sort of stay-at-home orders, a big surge in internet traffic, right? Went up 20 to 40% depending on the measurement or where it's measured. Basically, a year's worth of capacity growth in the internet was seen in about a week. So there's this question, right? How did different countries cope with this, surge in broadband traffic? And the evidence shows that the U.S. fared quite well. We saw about a 1% drop in network performance, not really perceptible, to be honest. I don't want to oversell this, right? Other countries did fine. Generally, most developed countries who have money to invest in networks did pretty well. But the United States really did do better than many of our peers. If you look at the average of all EU countries and the average of the four largest EU countries that kind of compare to the United States, it's Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. The European Union saw both a deeper descent and a more gradually recovery compared to the United States. This is measurement data from Ookla's speed test. So my takeaway is that we shouldn't change what works well. Our reliance on competition has seen consistent above average investment, right? More than double average for the EU is the US investment. And yeah, if we could move to the next slide, please. And particularly when you look at Italy or France, right, that has a more utility style model, they had real trouble with their networks with coping with this network load, which indicates that there's a significant risk to changing away from our model towards something that's more like a utility model. But at the same time, right, our model of private competition is quite strong. But the pandemic really did highlight, right, real gaps where competition just isn't designed to address. It's a lot like food or housing that we all consider essential, right? Even if you want to consider broadband an essential service, just like food or housing, we have private market to provide for most that does quite well, but we have a critical social safety net. I think we need the same for broadband. To my mind, there are three main areas that policymakers should focus on when it comes to. Well, I should mention, on this slide, right? Italy and France, right, saw a big dip. Some other countries, Netherlands has private competition to some extent as well, did quite well. But as you see, U.S., strong broadband speeds and relatively small dip that we quickly recovered from. If we can move to the next slide. So the three main areas that I think policymakers should focus on when it comes to closing the digital divide. The first, and that often gets, I think, maybe even more attention than some other areas deserve, is the issue of rural infrastructure, right? The actual access to broadband infrastructure. So there certainly is a gap here between rural and urban populations. There's about a quarter of Americans a quarter of rural Americans, I should say, don't have access to broadband at the current definition of 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. We've made good progress over the years. As you can see, these numbers have continued to tick upwards from 2015 on. But I think really more needs to be done, both for rural and tribal lands. We know that there's significant economic benefits to broadband access. The economic literature is really quite clear on that. So to my mind, there's a huge opportunity to galvanize political support here for a large infrastructure package. With interest rates as low as they are, I think a one-time large investment in broadband infrastructure for rural areas makes an awful lot of sense and could take a big step to close the rural gap for good. If we move to the next slide, please. So I think perhaps even bigger opportunities with adoption, right? Adoption is a critical component of the digital divide. I think arguably, maybe even a bigger opportunity than with infrastructure. We have more homes, more households that have access to broadband infrastructure, but don't subscribe than those who don't have access. So adoption is a complicated issue, right? Usually a mix of different causes. Maybe a lack of interest, a lack of relevance. Also increasingly now, the sort of substitutability between fixed and broadband drives a lot of people to go mobile only. But another key component is the affordability of broadband that's getting increasing attention, especially with the pandemic making the relevance of broadband quite obvious. So compared to other countries, we do have relatively affordable broadband. Generally, speaking in terms of pretty strong price discrimination. So the lower speed tiers, the sort of lower quality broadband is relatively cheap, whereas the United States, our higher speed broadband is somewhat more expensive than other countries. But a number of studies have concluded that we have relatively quite affordable broadband. But at the same time, given the huge spillover benefits to society, the incredibly important tool that broadband provides as a counter-cyclical tool to help people improve themselves, seek more education, find a job. Really, to my mind, cost should not be preventing anyone from accessing the internet. Here, again, I don't think that there's any real need for elaborate policy bank shots based on artificial or government-provided competition. We should just be addressing this problem directly: subsidize broadband for low-income Americans. And so to my mind here, there's a real opportunity, again, to expand existing programs, modernize the FCC's Lifeline program. I'm sure others in the panels can speak to these issues in more detail. So lastly, I wanted to note, I think an important part of the digital divide that I feel like doesn't always get sufficient attention is we really do need to focus also on the service side, on the supply side of the services that are provided over broadband. I think this is highlighted through the pandemic. Pandemic really accelerated the transition of many services going to an online-only environment. There's still more work that needs to be done. We have to invest more public resources in providing critical government services on a digital-first basis. I'm sure others, I thought it was heartbreaking to hear about unemployment websites crashing. It's like these are the tools that we really need to be able to work in this sort of scenario. With that, I hope this provides a good context, a good introduction to some of these issues, and I'm happy to turn it over to to the first panel, and we can hear more. Thank you very much for having me.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone once again to our first panel of the day. I want to introduce myself. My name is Jordan Crenshaw, and I am the Executive Director of Chamber's Technology Engagement Center. I manage broadband policy and lead broadband efforts and digital divide efforts at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce through its Telecom and E-commerce Policy Committee. I'd like to introduce our next panelists, and if they would make sure that they would get on video and on unmute themselves. We have Alicia Matthews, who's Vice President of Government Affairs and Strategic Initiatives at Comcast NBC Universal. We're also joined by Chad Roop, Administrator for the Rural Utility Service at the USDA. And finally, we're joined by Swami Kocherlakota, from the Executive Vice President and Global CIO of S&P Global. So thank you all for joining us today. The theme of today's panel is advancing access and adoption at the state and local level when it comes to broadband deployment. As Doug mentioned, the private sector-led broadband companies in America have led the world in making sure that the nation leads in capacity during the COVID-19 crisis, but unfortunately, at least 18 million Americans, according to the Federal Communications Commission, lack access to broadband, and there are some who also cannot afford adoption as well and linking in as well. So we want to talk about the other side of the equation from the private sector, and that is the public sector and how we can have public-private partnerships help bridge the digital divide together. So I think we'll go ahead and get right into it. And one other note too, if you have any questions for the panel, please put those in the chat feature and we'll make sure to take a look at those throughout the event. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and kick one question off to everyone on the panel. As we're looking at public-private partnerships, what are the kinds of partnerships you all are developing with state and localities, actually? Alicia, I'll kick it off to you, actually.
Great. Thank you very much, Jordan, and thank you so much for having Comcast. We're thrilled to be here today to talk about this very important issue. Comcast has been involved in a number of partnerships with state and local governments in order to close the digital divide. And we've done so both on the access side and the adoption side. On the access side, Comcast is participating in state broadband deployment programs. These are programs that are created by state entities or agencies within state government that use state funds to incent private investment to deploy broadband in unserved areas. The programs typically recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach and therefore open it up as a tech-neutral program, so invite a range of participants, including companies like Comcast. And we've been very successful in working with these types of partnerships. For example, in Massachusetts, the Mass Broadband Institute has had, over the years since 2015, we started working with the MBI. At that time, they had 53 unserved or partially served communities. Comcast worked with them. We are building out and completed some of the builds in 13 of those communities, reaching more homes than we had initially anticipated. And just recently, the MBI had been able to state that for all 53, they have a path forward with these types of programs. On the adoption side, we, for the past 9 years, have been offering Internet Essentials, which is a low-cost, low-income broadband program. It addresses many of the aspects of adoption, including the affordability piece, which offers our service for $9.95 a month as well as some of the other issues. There's free access to digital literacy in person when it's safe to do so, online, in written materials, and also an opportunity to buy a low-cost computer. During the pandemic, we opened up an offer for any new customer to sign up for Internet Essentials with 2 months free service. We've extended that offer through the end of this year. We've taken Internet Essentials a step further now and working with local governments, school districts, in a program we're calling Internet Essentials Partnership Program. This allows the whole community to come together to help connect and enroll folks into the Internet Essentials program. Those partnerships are kicking off now, and we're pleased to say we have about 70 schools that already have signed up for our program.
Chad, I'll pick it off to you then.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here today. I'd like to mention that the federal family is very engaged across all the federal government. The president, when he came into office, started the American Broadband Initiative. And what he did is he brought together 23 different federal agencies. And we are all working together kind of in an all hands on deck approach to this. And we've been working at this for a long time prior to the pandemic. And so it's something that as a result of the pandemic, it brought a spotlight onto the need in rural America, but we've been working on this for quite some time. The Secretary of Agriculture was one of the lead departments for this American Broadband Initiative. And as a result of that, we've done a lot of things, not just work to put money towards developing the infrastructure, but to find better ways of doing business. And definitely engaging with the private sector was key to that. In working with the NTIA and the FCC through different initiatives, we have actively engaged state governments, the state telecom associations, the National Rural Electric Cooperatives, along with the Rural Broadband Association, the Fiber Broadband Association. There's been a whole series of folks who we've engaged. In addition to that, with the FCC, I've been appointed by the Secretary to be his representative to the Precision Ag Task Force. So we have a lot of folks who are engaged with industry and the ag production to be able to find out better ways and how to truly leverage the opportunities that are brought by the advancing of emerging technologies. Specifically within rural utility service at USDA Rural Development, I'm in charge of about 270 plus people who work to deliver about $9 billion annually out in infrastructure for the United States, whether that be the electric grid or telecom or drinking water and wastewater. And what we've seen is that as there's been a known gap, and as members of cooperatives and different communities realize that they need to deliver these services for their citizens, they're coming together and they're taking a non-traditional approach to solving problems. So what we are looking at doing and what we have done in the last few years is we've really ramped up our ability to solve the middle mile fiber to help solve that access, and then also really engaged with really the Secretary's signature program called Reconnect, which Congress has been so kind to provide us funding to do. And so far we've delivered funding for last mile connectivity to 196,000 households. And we are working very diligently to deliver and finish the underwriting for here within the next few weeks on about $1 billion worth of funding for last mile connectivity. Last year, we delivered about 21,000 miles of fiber in our last mile, but our smart utility program, which delivers the middle mile for our electric co-ops, put out 9,000 miles of middle mile fiber. And so we're trying very hard to help solve that middle mile piece to it. Now, in addition to that, all of the above approach is so important. It's not just one type of technology that we need to solve this problem. If we're really going to advance economics in rural America, we have to have access to wireless as well as fiber, and the ability for satellite technology to engage as well. We really have to be flexible in our approaches and find ways to do this, because we have to justify the economics to get out there and make the case for these folks to take advantage of these technologies. So we're really looking at the ability to deliver wireless providers what they need to deliver on 5G. You know, we talk about 5G a lot. You hear the advertisements throughout the United States, but the reality is that we want to give people the access to get 4G in some cases, not just to 5G, but we're never going to get to 5G if we don't have an all of the above approach. So we're really dedicated to doing that across the federal family. I work regularly with the FCC in understanding where we are and trying to solve the mapping issue, where we don't overbuild, but we also give the maximum opportunity and education for people to where they understand how they can engage and reduce the capital cost to make it justifiable and affordable for people to do it, so that they're not having to pay an enormous debt bill to be able to get access to what they need for basic living standards.
No, Chad, that's a very good point you bring up in terms of trying to figure out exactly where we lack access and making sure that we don't waste funding in areas that already do. So appreciate your efforts as well. Swami, wanted to get your thoughts on what kind of partnerships you are seeing and any thoughts of that.
Sure. So thanks very much for having me, Jordan, TCS, Alicia, and Chad. It's great to be on the panel with you. See, S&P Global provides essential intelligence for people who are in the financial industry. We have a responsibility to accelerate progress in the world. And in that perspective, we have a division called S&P Global Ratings that works with the US public finance and local communities and states. If they're investing in infrastructure, we provide help and provide them ratings opinions. We also have a corporate responsibility and diversity foundation where we actually look at this problem in a different way. You know, advancing access and adoption is one thing, but then how do you really use that access and adoption to provide what Doug has mentioned as life chances, so that you can actually make a living out of it or accomplish and create progress for yourself. So we've been working with several organizations, nonprofit organizations, where we said from a K through 12 perspective, what can we as S&P Global can do to provide more, ability for people to leverage it for life chances. Obviously STEM is an important aspect of it. So from a K through 12, we partnered with a lot of organizations, couple of them to name. We partnered with First Robotics is an organization, and New York Academy of Sciences, their Global STEM Alliance. Not only we partner with them, for the students that they choose, we work with our employees and create them experiences so that they can get they can have experience on solving and understanding real world problems. And same thing, transitioning from K-12 to the university. So we partner with a program called Year Up, where we provide internship for those people who are going through that again in the area of STEM. And after graduation, from an entrepreneurial opportunities perspective or helping find the jobs, we work with a company or an organization called Upwardly Global, and also a lot of organizations that support to women entrepreneurship. So across the board, from K through 12 to college and post-college entrepreneurship or job, we partner with many organizations to see how we can allow and create life chances with STEM as the foundation, and kind of the foundation that Alicia and Chad and so many others are building.
Thank you. A question, I think, for Alicia and for Chad. What are the challenges and the barriers that you are seeing right now to deployment and developing partnerships to get access and adoption for broadband?
I can speak to that from Comcast perspective. I think that on the start with the access side, what we see are, I sort of outlined in my opening the kinds of programs we've been involved in. I think some of the challenges are when a state or locality has a particular technology in mind and limits any possible partnership to that one technology. So it's in that sense, it's limiting. We may not be able to participate, that kind of thing. I don't think we can talk about deploying broadband without mentioning Make Ready. That's the process of getting on the poles. So a wired broadband provider needs to attach to utility poles. We don't control that attachment, and there's a whole process that's involved. It's time-consuming, complicated, lots of work being done on the federal side and in states to sort of expedite that, but that is one of our challenges. I think on the adoption side, what we've seen is really just getting the word out, making people aware of the opportunity and the availability of these programs. Comcast works with a number of community-based organizations to try to reach their populations. Many of the constituents we try to reach are, English may be a second language, so we look for partnerships to help even bridge that. So I think that, again, we're always looking for additional partnerships to help us make sure people are aware of this offer and take advantage of it.
Thank you, Alicia.
I think from our perspective, one of the things that I've seen from a national level is every state has a different approach. And there's been many states that have allowed very flexible organizational structures to be able to deliver that last mile and the middle mile and talk about pole attachments and all of those things that are potential barriers. And when people have a traditional view of a utility, if you will, providing only one type of service, what that often means is that they end up limiting their thought on what can they do to help solve the problem. They don't necessarily have to be the last mile provider, but can they partner? Can they maximize use of the assets they already have, such as the dark fiber that is existing on those poles, the use of existing rights of way and easements, and when they're building infrastructure, doing all the above approach, allow people to come in and lay fiber or lay conduit to later lay fiber or whatever is needed to be able to help deliver that and have a future state look to an approach. Limiting someone's thought process through archaic state law is one of the biggest barriers that I think are out there. Fortunately, we've seen a lot of movement in that in the last few years, and so there's definitely a trend to be able to help solve that problem. Unfortunately, that's not the case in every state. And so I wish more states would take advantage of that kind of an opportunity, because I think we're going to have to take a very flexible approach to allow people to deliver that last mile. The affordability is definitely an issue, and affordability needs to, in my opinion, be first solved by proper access and making sure that organizations are willing to engage and deliver. There's a lot of opportunity out there. There's just, quite frankly, when you look at the continuously advancing technology and the needs that people have, there's never going to be enough federal money all by itself to solve this problem. We have to make smart use of federal funds to leverage private business to be able to deliver that last mile. And so we really have to have that engagement from everyone to be able to help solve this. And we have to have very flexible thought processes so that we don't artificially limit someone's ability to deliver. One of those barriers right now is not knowing who's served and who's unserved. We have to continue to work on that. We can't wait for 5 to 10 years out for that to be solved. We have to deliver on the fly. We have a lot of people that work very hard and put boots on the ground to look at what's served and what's unserved, but we really have to be better at mapping out our efforts and what private industry is doing and where that help is truly needed.
Thanks, Chad. We have just a few more minutes left, but I want to give everyone an opportunity to say if you've seen a place where this has been successful, let us know. And then also any action items that we should take away from this panel. So Alicia, I'll start with you then.
Yeah, so I mentioned Massachusetts as being one example of a well-structured broadband program that attracted not only you sort of traditional ISPs like Comcast and Charter, but some municipal electrics, some wireless companies, some newer entrants to the market. So I think Massachusetts is a great example. Similarly, in Virginia, there were 2 programs that we participated in that I think are very good and worthy of serving as models for other states. One is the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative that is overseen by the Department of Housing and Community Development. The partnerships are between the provider, the county, and the state. So the counties are really involved and able to help direct where they would like to see built out. So it gets a little bit to, I agree, there's some real questions about what's served and unserved and how we learn about that. But providers can offer some information, but we really need to have those boots on the ground from the counties or the localities. So in Virginia, working with the counties has helped us identify and really target where we need to go. The other program is a broadband program created by the Tobacco Region Revitalization Commission. There they repurposed some funds that they had for economic development in that region for broadband deployment. And we've had a really successful construction project there in Bedford County. We should be finishing up very soon. We've been able to reach almost 1,000 additional homes than we originally thought. I think by any measure, it's been a success. What I think was interesting for me about that is states need to find out where this funding is coming from. So there may be some federal funding that they can tap into, but the state dollars are few and far between. Here in Virginia, they took a fund that they had for a somewhat related purpose and put it toward broadband deployment. So a little bit of creative thinking there. So those are 3 programs that I would highlight as worthy of modeling.
So as a Virginian who is a fan of the Red Sox and Patriots, I'm glad to hear both states are leading the way in broadband partnerships. Chad, real quick, any final action items before we go?
Yes, I would say if you're looking at example projects from USDA, I would direct people to reconnect.usda.gov, and you'll see the list of successful projects where we've provided awards. I will say that there's definitely efforts way outside of Reconnect and USDA. In my home state of Wyoming, HUD provided community development block grant money through the state, the 5 statewide elected officials, and they just awarded $86 million to help solve the problem. And that problem was identified early on by bringing everyone together, getting the the Wyoming Telecom Association together, and we developed a broadband plan in 2018 before I took on my role here. And it was manifested when, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, money was provided to the state leadership, and they turned around and provided that money to help build out infrastructure for the long haul. And I think that was a very wise use of funds. And also to give a shout out to North Dakota. Governor Burgum has really done an outstanding job with trying to develop precision agriculture and get his state wired up and ready to go. So I think there's 2 strong examples there.
Swami, I think we have 1 more minute. I'll get you an action item as well too.
Look, I will say that thanks for the opportunity to be here. From where we found success is in actually working with non-government organizations and through this volunteer network. I find there are several success stories where we're able to take kids from schools and create experiences and give them these real world problems, climate analysis, even digital divide and issues related to the weather. We're able to take these problems and I would close and say that the work that we are doing with the NGOs will create more Steve Jobs and Bill Gates in these communities through which Elisa and Chad and the other governments are building, so that we can have more entrepreneurship and more innovation in the country.
Thank you, Swami. I'd also like to remind everyone too that the U.S. Chamber and the Technology Engagement Center released our own principles recently to deploy broadband with smart funding and with revenue neutral permitting reform. So I wanted to let everyone know that as a shameless plug, so you can see any of our work on tech at americaninnovators.com. But I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us. We've learned a lot, and we have a lot to learn from Virginia, Massachusetts, Wyoming, and North Dakota. So we'll be looking there as well. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to the last panel. We're going to get started here. My name is Caitlin Cadella-Lowe. I'm the Executive Director of Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Center for Education and Workforce. We're going to jump into the next panel on corporate digital responsibility. And as we've heard throughout the event, the private sector digital inclusion is not just an equity imperative, it's a business imperative. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these existing inequities across the board, and the ripple effect of disconnection is felt in every facet of life: e-commerce, telehealth, remote work. However, these inequities are particularly apparent in the public education systems. The ramifications of prolonged disconnection have led businesses of every size and sector to ramp up engagement in and investment in digital connectivity and to leverage partnerships to close the gap. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by two industry leaders to explore the uncommon alliances and lessons learned. I invite Michael and Anupam to turn on their cameras. Michael Daniels is the Director of Federal Government and Industry Relations for Land O'Lakes, Inc. Michael has spent most of his career focusing on rural broadband, rural healthcare, and rural economic development. He joins us from Arlington, Virginia. And Anupam Singhal is the Senior Vice President and Industry Solution Head at Tata Consultancy Services. Anupam heads Banking, Financial Services, and Industry Unit for US East and strongly believes that digital technologies enable businesses' competitive edge. And Anupam joins us from Princeton, New Jersey. So we're going to jump right into the discussion, and we'll try to leave some time for questions at the end too. As a reminder, please enter your questions in the chat box throughout the discussion, and we will try to get to them. I just want to make sure that Michael is on. Oh, there, he was on for a second. So I will ask this as Michael is getting on to Anupam, which is one thing that really jumps out to me is both of you work in just such different industry sectors, and yet your brand's interest in this particular challenge is very similar. So why does your organization see digital inclusion and equity as such an organizational imperative? Anupam, how about we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin, and it's an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So TCS, as you look at it, we have a very rich heritage of giving back to the society. The whole motto of our group, which was incorporated about 150 years, is on the basis of giving back to society. And as for the company, every dollar we make as a profit, 55 cents goes to charity. So giving back to society is in our DNA. Every TCS, and I represent here about 450,000 of them, who are working all across the globe to service our customers. If you look at the digital and the social responsibility, there are multiple ways to look at it. The whole thing comes down to how is the benefit is reached to the people who would need the help the maximum. And if you look at it from our business perspective, as we support some of the banks, and when the government came out with the Paycheck Protection Plan and under the Small Business Administration, we realized some of our banks, they were getting the request from the small businesses. Perhaps they will get some 800,000 a year, and they were getting tens of thousands in 2 days. So it became imperative for them to do something very different so that they are not able to make the business which is there on the table. But more than that, how do they service these small business communities who is looking for the banks to lend them the money to provide that support to the employees they work for? And that's where digital brings us digital expertise to enable these banks, and they could service and provide that help to the communities, the small business who were looking for that. So it is something which we were very, very proud to enable our customers to provide that community service. Second, as you would know, the whole country was going through the jobless claims. Many of the states, they never ever had the systems who can take so much volume in a so much shorter period of time. And that's where TCS worked and many of these state governments to improve the capacity of their legacy mainframe systems at a pro bono basis, and the people volunteered so that they can expand the capacity so that they can handle the jobless claims. So it's a multiple, and definitely I'm just talking about very specific to the current pandemic. What TCS also did, we have a platform to provide education, online education. And we realized that during this time, many of the schools in the country who couldn't have afforded the digital access to many of their students, we provided that access where they can go to the TCS ION platform and they can learn it could be the basic skills, it could be skills which could be helpful for them as they deal with the job losses, to equip them to be employable in a shorter period of time. So those are some of the areas which we've been participating in the current economic situation and the pandemic across the country.
Great, thanks. And Michael, how about you? How did you guys get into this?
Thanks, Caitlin. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So Land O'Lakes is one of the largest and oldest farmer-owned cooperatives in the country. In fact, next year we'll be celebrating our 100th anniversary. And I suspect that many people probably know us from our dairy foods business, the butter and the cheese that you see in the retail shelf at the grocery store. But we're actually bigger than that. We have a business called Winfield United, which is a crop input business. And we also have a business called Purina Animal Nutrition, which feeds large animals. And it's through this cooperative network and through our member owners that we touch approximately 50% of the harvested acres in the country and approximately 10,000 rural communities. And so from our perspective, from this farmer-owned cooperative lens, I would say that it's sort of a twofold proposition. One, we have seen an incremental rise in recent years in on-farm technologies, things like precision ag tools, smart tractors and GPS equipment and precision technologies that allow a farmer to be much more efficient and productive on their land. And so certainly in part, it's an effort to focus on that, where all those great tools aren't very useful if you can't be connected to the internet. They don't do a whole lot of good. And so that's absolutely part of it. But another part of it is something a little more holistic, a little bit broader speaking. And this goes back to when Beth Ford, our CEO, took over a couple of years ago and began spending a lot of time visiting with our members in these rural communities around the country, and witnessed firsthand this great need and this significant gap that exists out in many cases. For us, it's rural communities, but there are many other unserved locations as well, where our members simply can't get online. And if there's nothing that has been highlighted more than this, perhaps during this pandemic, it's been this great need for connectivity and the fundamental requirement that we all have now that so many of us are at home all the time. And so for us, it's a future and a vitality of rural communities at large, the ability for rural residents to have access to telemedicine services when perhaps their nearest healthcare provider is hours away by car. It's for opportunities for their children to remote learn, especially when so many schools are going to an online platform. And so it's this need for us to be online and to make sure that when these rural communities are already physically far apart, at the very least, we want to make sure that they remain digitally connected. And so that is a main focus for us in this effort.
Great. So Michael, to this point for you and Anupam as well, both of your organizations have sort of joined forces on a number of fronts to talk about this issue and bring this to light in this moment in time, but also as a part of your DNA, as you had both mentioned. So how are you partnering with both small, medium, large businesses to talk about this? Michael, if you could just touch on the coalition work that you have done.
Sure, thank you. So going back to the original drive behind this of trying to find a way to advocate for better connectivity in these unserved and, like I said, for us, rural communities. We at Land O'Lakes have focused on organizing a coalition of stakeholders. And this began several months ago at the start of the pandemic, really, where we joined forces with 4 founding members. Those included Microsoft, CoBank, Health Partners, and the Mayo Clinic. And together, we began to organize around an advocacy mission supporting primarily 3 main policy pillars in this area. So one is the need for a significant federal investment in broadband. We've heard from some of the speakers earlier, and I suspect that this audience may be very familiar with generally speaking, the lack of a business case in these very disparate areas with low population density. So a significant federal investment. Second, a need for improved federal broadband mapping. And third, better coordination between government agencies that work in this space, both at the federal level and at the state level. And so it was around these 3 policy pillars that we organized this diverse group of stakeholders. We started that work, as I said, back in April with the original members, and over time have grown to include many more partners. We formally launched in the beginning of July with 49 members, where we reached out with a letter to the president and the congressional leadership. And again, much of this work is done through policy advocacy at the federal government level. And to date, I can tell you, actually, as of yesterday, we have gone over 100 members. And this coalition, it's known as the American Connection Project Broadband Coalition. There's a website, americanconnectionproject.com, where you can read more. And we now have over 100 members, and this includes small businesses, small rural telcos, for example, all the way up to other large Fortune 500 companies like us. And so it is this diversity of our membership, I think, that brings some unique value to the group, where it's a group of stakeholders that might not otherwise or ordinarily join together, but we can all agree that now more than ever there is a need to advocate for better connectivity. And so we've joined together in this effort to focus on that.
Quick follow-on question to that, Michael, is
Sure.
any person who might be listening to this that's interested in potentially joining that coalition, how might they go about doing that?
Absolutely. So again, visit the website, or they're free to email me. That would be fine. mdaniels@landolakes.com. And I would be more than happy to talk to you more about it and share some more of the details. But we would welcome anyone who's interested in advocating for those 3 main policies I talked about. It's free to join, I should mention, so no cost of entry, and we'd be happy to have you.
That's great. And Anupam, how has your organization partnered on solving this issue?
So, Caitlin, is interesting, and many times, many of us will talk about what it means not having digital connectivity. And personally, I experienced about 3 weeks back in New Jersey, there was a storm, and I was out of power for 48 hours. And it was just not the power; there was no Wi-Fi, there's no cell phone signal. So one realized the importance of it. Practically, in this situation, when we are mostly dependent upon connecting remote, you're virtually out of absolutely business, personal, nothing was there. And that's where you realize the importance of having this bandwidth, and it comes to clearly hits you what happens to the communities when they don't have the privilege to do. And as I was looking around, I said, where do I find a phone signal? I happened to reach to the public library, and that's where I realized perhaps they had the power, they had the system, and a lot of people around public library sitting outside because they're still closed, and they were connecting and they were doing work. There were small children who were doing their homework, and there were people who were perhaps doing their job as well. So the connectivity is extremely important, and I'm glad to hear some of my colleagues on the panel, both the government as well as the consortium, which are taking this for federal government to provide that funding. What we are doing, what it means if this funding is there, connectivity is there, what are the resources which are available to these schools? And that's where TCS invested significantly in Ignite My Future program, and the Go IT, where we reached out to small, the medium, the high schools and the schools wherein they don't have those funding when they can invest into these programs. So TCS teams, we went there to conduct those programs, which was pre-COVID I'm talking about, wherein we wanted the kids to become interested in STEM. so that we can create that workforce who can develop their career in the technology. If you look at today, STEM is the focus. So whether it's the young kids in the middle school or the high school, how do we encourage them to take engineering as they go for their undergrad courses? Side by side, the women. So we are part of the Million Women Mentors program, wherein again, we are mentoring the women so that they can come into the corporate life and provide that, and leverage their talent. In addition to that, during the COVID period, what we did, how did we teach some of the students? So whether it's sending a video over the phone or a text message, so that some of the stuff we can help them, prepare them in some of the educational needs which they have as they go along. So these are some of the areas which we try to bring up the society, and the two things that I talked about supporting the business and the government. But we believe it's this continuous sustained effort which we need to keep on doing for the society to bring up that awareness of not only the STEM education, but preparing the workforce of future where the technology is the core.
Yeah, no, exactly. The issues that we were working on pre-pandemic still exist today, and will exist for some time. One quick question about best practices. Both of you have brought up, some existing work, and wondering, similar to the other panel, if you guys have sort of showcase places or companies or locations that you can point out as a best practice that we can look to in terms of an example.
I'll take a stab at that one. So I would go back to the coalition work. I mean, the interesting part about what we've done with the coalition is we've entered into this working relationship with so many organizations that we otherwise may not have ever had occasion to work with. And I think that that's something we've seen a lot of value out of. So in terms of best practices, I mean, one takeaway that I've had at least is the value in having these diverse perspectives. Part of the challenge sometimes is that if you're in somewhat of an echo chamber where perhaps you're all speaking to the same message and don't have an opportunity to hear any sort of debate or discussion, you could fall into the trap of not having all the perspectives to make good decisions. And so at least through this process, we have had a lot of healthy debate and discussion. And as you might imagine, with 100 members, there are conflicting opinions in many cases. And so we have done our best to sort of stay above the fray on that and keep it high level for the benefit of the group at large. But I think that's been one real benefit that we've seen through this work. And going forward, as we further drill down into some of the nuances of the policies, we will continue to have that benefit, I think, and sort of anticipate challenges and hurdles and opposition and so forth, and try to overcome those before we go out with official positions.
And for us, what we did, we went to some of the places like Nashville, Chattanooga, in Tennessee, Jackson, Wyoming, to have some unconventional alliances where we can have tech and digital led innovation to startups healthcare. What we also did, we worked with the American Red Cross and Canadian Red Cross to go and map some of the localities which were not able to get the assistance from whether the local municipal governments or whether it's the state governments. So we could map them, all these communities, so that they can have an access and they can be provided support to as well.
I'm getting a couple of questions from the audience, and one is, what are the factors that impact affordability of doing this work? And I wonder, Michael, if part of this broad coalition, affordability is a part of the conversation, and where that stands.
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly in rural communities, I can speak to that more specifically. But when you have a very low population density, very few customers per square mile, for instance, it becomes basically an impossible business task for a service provider to make a case to provide service to that area when the only way that they could recoup their investment on its own would be through the rates being paid by the customers. And without any sort of government support, they would have to charge an exorbitant fee to the customer in order to recoup the cost of their capital investment to deploy a network. And so that is why they rely on programs such as the Rural Utility Service that Administrator Roop spoke to earlier, FCC, Universal Service, those key government programs that allow the service providers to get that government support, deploy a network to a very dispersed community, and in turn, not have to charge an arm and a leg to a customer so that they can still have a customer afford the service, basically. And so that's a real challenge in rural communities, which is why, again, we supported this need to do it without that.
Yeah, and it's interestingly, just to add to the point, as we scan through the world, there are a lot of developing countries where the cost of data is much cheaper, perhaps 1,000th of what's there in these states. So perhaps that's also which we need to look at it, whether the data charges which many of the service providers charge, is it something which is really reasonable when the public access and the more people can afford? Because smartphones as well, they can be at a multiple price point, but the ability to provide that data at a much lower cost, and the industry can compare what's there in countries like in the South Asia, where most of the students, they are surviving on their smartphones to have online education. And I think that is something the governmental representative, the federal government and the chambers, they need to look at it, how this can be provided at much more nominal costs compared to the cost points which we have right now.
Another question coming in is, how has COVID and the immediate disaster response impacted the infrastructure funding around this? And wonder if either of you can speak to that.
Sure. So a couple ways. One, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but it has really highlighted the need for this. I mean, this was, we were gathering some momentum, bipartisan momentum behind this issue before the spring. Now it's just through the roof. And so there have been a number of bills introduced in Congress this year that address this issue in one way or another through funding and other means. There was money, there has been money in some of the COVID relief legislation that's gone through Congress. So the CARES Act, for example, earlier this year, the HEROES Act that passed the House, that there have been opportunities. And so I think there is certainly debate between the two parties right now and between the two sides of the Hill on what that will look like if and when there is another COVID relief bill. But I think it has merely heightened the need and the urgency of the issue. So I think that's really been a top of mind. Now, again, we'll see what happens with that. It's, you know, we've got appropriations deadlines coming up soon, and who knows how that might go.
Anupam, anything to add?
No, nothing, because if you look from the infrastructure perspective, we really have to see the price point which is there. And as I mentioned earlier, I think really government or the public-private partnership needs to clearly look at it. What is the right price point? Whether there could be some subsidy which could be there for the students and some of the communities which cannot afford to have Wi-Fi or the very costly data plans. I think that is something which can be looked from the infrastructure perspective, or it could be the government policy where the Wi-Fi or internet becomes a basic facility one everybody needs to have. Otherwise, it would really remain a challenge as we look at the current situation and the situation going forward as well.
Yeah. Well, we're just at 1 minute left here, so I'll give you both a chance to sort of close out with your last statements. And just thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and both of the work that you and your organizations have spearheaded in the connectivity gap.
Let me start. So it's incidental that this month, the month of August, we celebrate Sadhana Samarpan month. What it means is you're pursuing the dedication to the community. So the TCS team all across the world, we work with our local communities, and we are doing it for the last 6 years, and this is the 6th year which is running. For the whole month we go. And as we look at this specific year, because of the current pandemic situation, we had a different challenge. Earlier, we'll go to the community personally and do it. But herein, we realize what are the different tools and technology which will require, and which are developing our people who are predominantly our engineers. They're developing those solutions, they're developing those apps, they're developing technology, so that how can we create much more virtual support to the communities as compared to what we'll do in the classroom at this. So definitely that has been one of the core focus which we pursued in the whole digital social responsibility perspective.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks to everyone for having me today. Just one last thing I wanted to mention that sort of goes in conjunction with the American Connection project is that at Land O'Lakes, as well as at some of our member partner companies and organizations, we have begun to turn on publicly available Wi-Fi at many of our rural locations around the country. We've had around 150 in about 15 states that we have turned on, where people can drive up to one of our facilities, stay safely in their car in the parking lot, and get online to do any of these services that we've talked about: telehealth, distance learning, etc. We've invited our other coalition partners to join us in this effort to the extent that they have physical locations as well. And through that network, we're going to be announcing soon, I think, hundreds more that will be coming online. So we would encourage people. I know this is just a short-term solution. We can't expect people to be getting online from their cars, but at least during this current crisis, it was one additional opportunity that from our perspective, we could try to help out these communities. And so again, encourage people to join us in that effort and to reach out about the coalition if interested.
Thanks, Michael, and we'll certainly, if anyone wants to reach out to the organizers of this event with questions about the coalition, we can make those connections for you, Michael, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the work that you're doing, and thanks for joining us on this panel.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
And I just also wanted to thank Caitlin, Anupam, Michael, TCS, the leadership of Land O'Lakes, and the many other companies out there that are stepping up here. We've only breached the surface of the challenges that surround the digital divide, but it is clear that there is a real opportunity and a real responsibility to accelerate deployment, adoption, and digital literacy in a way that's not just accessible and affordable, but also approachable for everyone. My name is Alexa Miller. I am the Managing Director of the larger Digital Empowers program. The Chamber Foundation and TCS may have been on this journey for 2 years so far, but we're really just at the start of a Tech for Good movement. And I want to invite all of you guys to join in that with us. We've got a really exciting few weeks ahead of us with our 3rd annual summit coming up October 7th and 8th. Please mark your calendars. That'll be held in conjunction with our first Pitch for Purpose competition, startup competition for early stage social entrepreneurs. They'll be pitching in front of the live audience on our virtual stage for $15,000. So would love to engage everybody in that effort and part of the celebrations. You'll learn more about all of our upcoming programming in our post-event communications. So stay tuned for that. And I really appreciate all of your honest feedback in the post-event survey. And don't hesitate to reach out to me at any time. You'll have all of my communications in that email as well. So with that, I will leave the rest of the afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us.